Good morning. All right, y'all. Let's see if I can find Dr. White. Hey, morning, everybody. Let's see. Filling up pretty quickly. So hopefully some of y'all are returning, but if this is your first week with our Politics of Food conversation, then I'm Trace Nelson, and I'm representing Black food folks. This is our 8th week. It's going to be so good. And let me bring Dr. White. Good morning, y'all. Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Looking great.
Thank you. You too, my dear.
Thank you so much. So, all right, we'll jump right in. I'm Trace Nelson, and I am representing Black food folks in this really interesting collaboration between Black food folks and Afropunk. We're on every Monday at 11 a.m., and this is week 8, and it is the conversations we've had so far have been really brilliant. But one of the people who was on top of my list, my wish list to have in this space, has certainly been Dr. Monica White. Dr. Monica White is a tenured professor at the University of Wisconsin. The work she does is centered in agricultural, environmental studies. She's a hardcore activist with deep roots in Detroit. Her work in terms of community organizing and contextualizing the food system and the connection to Black liberation is prolific. And she is the author of the award-winning Freedom Farmers, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important manuals that we have for the context of Black life and Black agency and sort of farming and agriculture as a construct. So I'm just so excited to have Dr. White.
Thank you for all your love and support while I was writing. And since the book is out, you've been a big support, and I appreciate you.
Always. So I wanted to start because I think if y'all have been following this series, we sort of contextualize this conversation around the politics of food. And it's a really broad idea. It sort of asks people to think. I think the idea of it has really just been about asking people to consider the broader food system, especially in moments like this with COVID and civil unrest and just this sort of feeling of unease. A place that always feels rooted, even outside of this context, is the world of farming, especially Black farming. And so I know your life is so wrapped up and tied into all aspects of that movement. And I'm wondering if you could start just by sort of giving folks a little context for your background and this sort of life in Detroit.
Yeah. Thank you. In honor of celebrating the Babas and the fathers and masculine energy, I just sort of grateful and want to pay my own honors to my dad who raised me and really sort of fed my intellectual curiosity, right? He was a professor, but he was also known as a cook, a chef. Cooking was his love language. And I grew up knowing and experiencing the communal importance and significance of food. So we grew food, he shared food, he made feijoada. Before I knew that was the name, everybody was like, yeah, Dr. White make those black beans, right? And so he was able to really demonstrate his love to others through cooking. Another part of our routine, every Saturday, we would go to the Eastern Market in Detroit, one of the oldest open air markets in the country. And every Saturday, I don't remember who was selling fried chicken in a bag, but we would get our chicken and we would sit down and eat it. And he would say, okay, well, tell me what's going on. What do you see? So it was looking at enjoying the food, the cultural food, but also telling stories of people who were walking by. So he would say, what do you think is going on there? And what do you think? And so this intellectual curiosity was one that I learned that there was value and importance in story, and culture was an important lens to understand that. I'm that generation who, my parents are from Mobile, Alabama, and Eden, North Carolina. So every summer we would spend down in the down south. And I, love my Aunt Zodi, would make, grew her own okra behind the garage. But it was something about somebody getting a pickup truck and fishing and, just the soil that really called to me. So as a kid, I really had an appreciation for farmers, farming, soil, and nature. And so I think when I had a chance to move back to Detroit to care for my parents, I knew that there was this movement in Detroit, this urban ag movement, and I took that opportunity to ask some questions about, who did I know who grew food, and who were the people represented in those stories, right? So my dad grew food. My grandmother had a container garden. She was in a wheelchair. And my sister grew food on the east side of Detroit. And so looking at the images of who was involved in the movement didn't match the stories of my family. And so I wanted to make sure that I captured some of the richness that I thought folks were missing.
That's right. I wonder because I think a lot of the questions that get asked during these conversations is for folks who are in communities that feel disempowered, and how, like, where the connection points are. And so I feel like there's, like, you just sort of really beautifully talked about how someone as brilliant as you gives birth, like, right, how, what all the influences are that make you as curious as you would need to be to take the path that you took. Because I think about the way in which you use the academy and sort of academic spaces to be this really particular battleground, sort of in the tradition of, like, Du Bois, and, like, I just feel like there's this really particular way in which you're using your space in the academy to really interrogate in a way that is probably not typical, if in terms of environmental studies.
Sure. Yeah, the beauty of being raised with an intellectual curiosity is that I've always sort of, as Chimamanda Adichie says, I'm always wondering what other stories have been muted, right? And so in recognizing that there are particular stories that are muted, it's just sort of been my calling to say, okay, this is what we know, but what don't we know? And then that kind of, following that trail, just unearth such richness and such beauty in the people and the voices who are often ignored or overlooked. So for me, the thing is, like, I've always felt like the academy is a tool, and how can I use the tool to liberate my people? And in using the tool, that I'm always dancing between community and university, knowing where my heart always is, but really sort of taking the resources of the university, making sure that community has access to those resources, making sure that the excellence and the brilliance of community is translated into language for the academy, and always sort of dancing in between these different worlds has been something that just feels like it's my sweet spot, right? That's my superpower.
That's right.
It's like, oh, okay, this isn't available for everyone. So how do we remove those barriers, those boundaries?
That's right. Now, I talked to Davita Davis in the first week of this series, and she lifts up so many names in Detroit that should ring more bells nationally, that we should be thinking about and sort of looking to as resources, and sort of, like, just I feel like those sort of iconic names, right? And I feel like in a lot of ways, the activist work you do, it's sort of like there's a lens that you bring in terms of your sort of academic acumen into activist spaces where there may be blind spots. And I think sometimes we don't really realize that we need all these disciplines in the same space in community. And so I wonder if you could talk about, because I mean, again, the sort of radicalization of young people is a lot of what we're thinking about now, right? Like, watching these young people, the Black Lives Matter movement, all these other movements sort of take to the streets, but they kind of have to be armed with tools. And so I'm wondering how you really kind of got entrenched in the active space in Detroit, because it's, again, like New York, like the Bronx, like all these spaces that are so iconically activist centered, have a particular energy, and you got to kind of find your lane, to find your space in that kind of mechanism.
Yes. So the beauty of it is, I was moving back to Detroit to care for my parents, and I knew that there was something in the urban ag movement that was missing, right? There was a story. So when I moved to Detroit, I was encouraged to engage in the 67 Rebellion acknowledgement in 2007. And as a part of that committee, I met Baba Malik Yakini, who was also part of the planning committee, right? So we had this amazing, incredible Rebellion conference. And then I was sitting and, just sort of really wanting to unpack this story of urban agriculture. And I reached out to my dear friend, sister friend, Dr. Ife Kilimanjaro. And I was like, sis, like, who do you know that's in it? She was like, you just got finished spending time with Malik, right? How did you miss this conversation? So I, attended the meeting. I reached out to him. I was like, hey, I want to understand why we are growing food. And it wasn't an easy, right? It wasn't an easy conversation for me to just come in with my pen and paper and say, I'm from the university, please tell me. There
Yeah,
are reasons that people are skeptical, right? That our people especially are skeptical of academics. And so it was not easy. It was a fight. It was hard. It was brutal. But I feel like I had to prove myself and let folks know that I wasn't doing this quote for tenure, that I was really committed to this work. And so Baba Malik is an educator among many other things, and just taught me the language of justice, of food justice
mm-hmm.
specifically, right? My PhD was long over, my degree, my program was long over, but I learned food justice language, like the difference between sovereignty and security, why Black people are doing this work. And I remember in a car, I was sitting with Mama Neferah, who was our first farm manager, and I was like, how can you see D-Town and just not get caught up, right? How could you be amongst all of this and just like not have to, hold people back because of, and she looked at me and she said, some folks get it immediately and others don't. And then what I've learned in the over 10 years that we've been doing this work is that the 10 years has been the foundation upon which our people are now coming to us and saying, we need skills, we need seeds, we need food, and because of 10 years at least in the game, now we have laid the foundation that folks are now sort of coming and asking these kinds of questions with fervor that I haven't seen quite before. And it's pretty exciting.
Absolutely. And I guess that's one of the things I'm interested in as well. I think a lot about how we build community. I think sometimes we discount the resources we have and what those resources look like. And we sort of overlook the fact that like they're gonna have to look different in Black and brown spaces. They're not gonna feel or see the same as you would think in sort of mainstream culture. And so we sort of overlook the wealth of resources that we have.
Right.
We're gonna circle back to this because it's
I do
really
want to put
important.
a pin in it too, because when you
Yeah,
say overlooking the resources that we have, I think that the work that I do decentralize that takes the attention away from the university and gives a microphone to the farmers. So I want
that
to put that pin. Okay, so
yeah.
come back to that.
Yeah, we definitely gonna put a pin there
Okay.
because I
Okay.
think that some of why I love your work so much is really centered in freedom farmers and this idea about knowing history, right? The point you just made about the language of resistance is so important because I think there's such a it feels sometimes like a disconnect for people kind of coming to the realization, that aha moment you talked about, people kind of coming to or meeting people where they are, but being intimidated by the language that they don't understand, not having the vocabulary necessary to be part of these spaces. And I think sometimes when we look back to history, all of a sudden the context of the fact that we've been in these resistance streets is a really interesting equalizer.
Yeah.
And so Freedom Farmers becomes this really, I mean, it's the book I tell everybody who's interested in this movement at all to go to first, because it's first of all, it's so dexterous and tight in terms of content.
Thank
Like it's
you.
5 solid chapters, but if you understand these 5 particular narratives, you get it
Thank
immediately.
you. Thank
So I would love for you to
you,
talk a little bit
sis.
about the research process and just the sort of birth of this baby, because
Yeah.
it's a lot of work. You got access to archives that, I mean, are overlooked in a lot of ways. Some of them probably were tricky to get into, but just what that process is, because this book is really singular in a lot of ways.
Thank you. So before I started writing down asking any questions with, like doing any interviews, I spent 2 years in the movement as the team leader for Thursdays at D-Town. I just want to fully immerse myself in everything I could see and witness. I wanted to teach myself before I came and ask people what they were doing and why did they do what they were doing, because their time is valuable, right? So let me do my homework first, and then I come holler at you once I have my my question, my foundation. And then it was just I'm one of those people, like I said, I'm always asking, okay, so what do we know and what don't we know? But the other question my dad always raised me to say, he meant it kind of sarcastically, like, girl, go somewhere and make yourself useful. But I turn that around. And in those spaces that I occupy, I'm always asking the question, how can I be helpful? How can I be useful? And how can the tools of the academy that has, my relationship with the academy is fraught, right? It hasn't always been, peaches and cream. It's been some struggles, some knockdown dragouts. And the space is contentious for obvious reasons. But I always felt like books were my friends and
Mm.
learning was my superpower. And so being able to communicate to multiple different audiences was important. So I was listening to the questions that folks were asking in Detroit, and I said to myself, like, there have to have been other moments in history when Black folks have turned to agriculture as a strategy of resistance and resilience. So then it was like, okay, so then I asked the question, okay, so then if so, then who? And just started mapping the trajectory. So it started in Detroit, but you can't talk about agriculture in Detroit without going down south, right? And
Right.
so when I went down south and I met people like Reverend Paris, who gave me like this was the whole map. Like, you know how you're driving on the freeway, you're like, am I going the right way? Am I going the right way? So Reverend Paris said, you can free yourself when you can feed yourself. And I was like, that's my thesis. That's my
That's right.
whole, right? So he said that, Mr. Ben Burkett, who can tell you like when you walk the land with Mr.
Yes.
Burkett, it's like watching an artist surveying, just, the creativity and the canvas, right? And so he
Yes.
can tell you flora, fauna, and feather. I'll be like, Mr. B, what's this? Well, the technical name is, and and I'm just sitting there like mind blown. And so the question was co-created in the rooms and the spaces where justice, where we were talking about freedom and justice. So we co-created the question, and then I took on it's like, okay, well, I got my orders. Let me go on down south to the archives. Let me unearth these stories. And a part of that process was also, engaging with farmers, because I would spend the day in the archives touching the documents of Mrs. Hamer's Freedom Farm. And then at night, I might call and be like, Daniel, come, let's talk about such and such. And we might have a tailgate on the back of the pickup truck. It might be some, fish fry. It might be wild
Mm-hmm.
hog sausage. Who knows what it was, right? We would cook, and I would have questions. So I would get the documents, but I would also allow farmers to help me shape it. And
That's right.
one goal was I wanted to really find a way to honor and respect the centuries of Black labor that has been overlooked and devalued, right? And in some ways, people were even sort of embarrassed about our agricultural history. So I really wanted us to rethink that. And in another way, I don't understand how we have come to believe farmers to not be brilliant. I don't know where that came from,
I
because
mean, the
you walk
science
and you
alone.
high mathematical computations in a very quick moment. Look at a bag and tell you how much profit, how much land, how many pounds of whatever, right? So this whole reality that what does the South mean, and who
Mm,
are farmers, and what
mm.
does the rural community offer us as a strategy toward our collective Black freedom? Like, these are the kind of questions that I was just sort of like, I can't answer these using the scholarship that existed before me. I
That's
had
right.
to go out because my questions were different. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times the academy teaches us what is the statement of the problem. It's always a problem. So if I come into your house and I'm like, ooh, well, this is wrong and this is wrong and this is, how does that make you feel? Opposed to that, I always took I wanted to take an asset-based approach, which was every entity, every community has something upon which to build. And
Yeah.
so if I'm asking you, what are the strengths of this? Help me paint this picture. Then I think that's that's tipping the conversation, right? That's changing the conversation from me having the answers to the folks who live this reality having the answers and helping me shape and understand it. So
That's
it
right.
was just, and it's been, even when I was writing, if I get stuck, I would call. I remember there was a time I was working on Mrs. Hamer's chapter, and I called Venus Williams, who runs an organization here in Milwaukee, Alice's Garden. I said, Miss Venus, I'm stuck. Help me. She organized a community listening session, maybe like 30
Mm.
people. And I was like, okay, so here's what I know, and here's where I'm stuck. And the community just wrapped their arms around me. They were like, go ahead, sister, do this. And I think in addition to having the community support at the end, I think another thing that I often don't mention is that when I was beginning the chapters on the three wise men, I asked permission to proceed, right? I went to Tuskegee. I asked the land to give me permission to interrogate those stories and to be open to what message 100 years later we should be thinking about. Went to
That.
Mrs. Hamer's resting place, asked for permission to proceed and to tell the story. So to me, I was always like, I didn't want my lens to be the focus. I wanted to be the conduit through which the stories of our ancestors can talk and tell us what we should be thinking about. So that was a non-traditional, nobody taught me that in grad school.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You don't get that in methods. Go ask the ancestors. But I always knew that the academy could provide some, but the
Mm.
culture provided what I needed to really be rooted in the stories that our people needed to hear right now.
That's right. So much in that to unpack, and so much that is no, seriously, because I was just talking to Aunt Andrea Roberts out of Austin, and she has the Texas Freedom Colonies Project,
Okay.
and she talked a lot. We talked
Yeah.
on Juneteenth at Schaumburg about she used the terminology asset based approach as well, and
Yeah.
it was so important because like you said, it just shifts the lens
That's
immediately.
right.
Like you, and so I was interested in that part, but there's so many. I mean, each chapter is like a. I mean, I don't know, it's like this beautiful jewel,
Thank
but
you.
the Three Wise Men section was absolutely. I mean, because it really has me thinking a lot about the context of the work we do currently, right? Like we have to sort of be beholden to legacy in a lot of ways, or history in a lot of ways. Like we want to be on the right side of history. It's a really sort of
Right.
consideration that a lot of people are considering. But I wonder about when we really sort of interrogate 100 years ago, and we don't put into context what all
Girl,
the complicated nature of that moment,
honey.
especially to ski. And I'm wondering if you have any insight, because I feel like right now,
Mm.
um, the way that like environmental studies and sort of agricultural studies is having to sort of grow into a more broad approach and a more sort of the ability to interrogate the way you interrogate is shifting all over the country. And so I'm wondering about one, if you feel this moment in environmental studies, especially in agricultural studies, is benefiting from or is sort of listening to your approach, and if what insights you feel from looking back at those three wise men, because we use a lot of that data to inform how we engage our culture currently,
Yeah.
but we don't
Yeah.
really interrogate it in a way that is honest about the circumstances with which it like that research was happening.
Yes. So the first question, I don't know that I can answer that part. Hold on. I'm gonna put a
Hmm.
pause in that question.
Okay.
The second part of the question is, so if you read the Three Wise Men, that was just not an easy chapter to write, right? I feel like George Washington Carver is such a wonderful, incredible human that to really sort of tell the fullness of his story and not reduce him to the soybean and the peanut, right?
Mhm.
And children's stories during Black History Month, to really sort of anchor his work as a predecessor to talking about, right, the true father of organic and sustainable agriculture that I think has been dismissed, right? So he's easy to write about, right? Because he says stuff like, I would go in my office and I would close the blinds because I didn't want people to know how much I was working, right? I mean, just his whole love for the people was really easy to write
Mhm.
about. The Du Bois chapter I thought was a little bit more difficult. Was building on the work of Dr. Jessica Nimhard's book, Collective Courage, and was just sort of able to just sort of concentrate on his idea about a system, right? That Black people, while segregated, could also come out of segregation as a strong force, being able to provide for ourselves, right? Now, Booker T was so hard to write about, and he was hard to write about for the obvious and the unobvious,
Mhm.
right? The obvious reasons that he said some things that were really not okay to say about Black people as farmers without, I mean, you can't say Black people are, as farmers, are this, and this without actually interrogating the structures that created, right, a lack of education, a lack of access. Like, you can't do that, right? You can't say you do this without also pushing against the structure. So I felt that was a problem. So I literally had to go into, and I have weird research techniques and strategies, but in order to tell the story of Booker T, I wanted to like erase the board. I wanted to erase what I thought I knew, and with new eyes and open eyes, just sort of say, okay, here's what he did well. Here's what he didn't do so well. And I'm not trying to say forgive him, but I do think that we should complicate his legacy, because we often reduce him to a school, an argument, and a speech. And
Yes.
I know when my time is done, I really hope that there's a more nuanced assessment of who I am than three things. They're not
Yes.
small things. They're significant things. But I do think if we talk and think about what did Tuskegee then mean, and what does Tuskegee mean to us now, and why we need to uphold it as a part of our agricultural legacy, I just feel like these are just, it requires a new lens. And the other
Yes.
question I was asking was, and this is something if somebody's listening, probably take my idea, but I really wanted to, I wanted to see not just what he said, but what did he say and to whom was he speaking? Because
Oh
when
my
you
God.
think, right, when you think about the context, maybe what he was saying was what he was saying in order to get the school funded. Now, I don't think you should chase money. I don't think that you should compromise your values and your morals for the sake of
No.
that. But I
However,
do think, right? But I do think that his experience, he was the oldest, he had experienced slavery to the greatest degree, and his perspective was probably rooted in that trauma. And so I mean, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze
no,
it,
no, no.
but I'm just saying that all of our people deserve to complicate that story, right? It should be a little more to unearth, to understand, and to put in context. I think that we
That's right.
benefit when we do that.
Absolutely.
So I do
Oh,
say it's the three wise men, but the sister who showed them how to do it. And I also talk about Mrs. Hamer as an organic intellectual, because I do think, as we can come back to this point, that we elevate the formal education, and we say that is, I don't know, more valued. But as Mr. Burkett told me one day, we were walking his land, and he said, my parents sold cotton so that I can go to college. He said, but what I learned in college is not what happens on the farm. And so you can have the academic study and you can have what's practiced, but you can't grow without having knowledge of both. And I think we mute the voice of practitioners and laborers, and we do so to our detriment, right?
yes,
Because as COVID has revealed to us, we need producers, we need processors, we need distributors, we need preparers, and we also need to close the food loop by also capturing the food and recycling it in a variety of different ways. So I just feel like, you can't have the whole story without also understanding what did this look like, and then also not just what it looked like. And I'm just going to come just this one point,
mm,
which is, what does success look like, right? I had a grad student who came into my office and was like, I want to talk to you about your data. Oh, really? And
mm,
so just started the conversation by saying something like, I don't believe Mrs. Hamer had the capacity. And then I kind of saw red. And then I was like, okay, well, let me put my professor hat back on. And so
right,
they had done a few searches and thought that I was overstating the data. Didn't know that I had receipts, right?
right.
And so, it's really like, could she really? And I said, well, to me, this is one of privileging university experience and information. And the other thing is that I just think that while Freedom Farm was not, quote, successful in providing all the things that it sought to accomplish, I do think that our returning to what Freedom Farm meant 50 years ago and what it can mean now
That part.
is really a
Yeah,
legacy. We're
yeah,
inheriting a legacy, and every generation has an obligation to add something different to movements. And so Mrs. Hamer showed us what it looked like. And
that's
now
right.
we get a chance to a greater degree, benefit from her expertise and to demonstrate what this looks like. And so in doing so, I think it puts Mrs. Hamer's work even higher because, and I'll just be, clear, there's nothing
Yeah,
like picking okra in the Mississippi heat. And so, right, you know what I'm saying? So how
that's
do we
right.
honor the labor and the laborers and elevate their work to where I think it should be?
Amen, amen, amen. I mean, it's because you're so right, and I think moments like the COVID, I think is an interesting equalizer, or has the potential to be an interesting equalizer in a lot of ways. I think that our realization, it's so interesting to hear people talking about cooking for themselves for the first time,
Yeah,
but also being
right,
concerned about food source
right.
for the first time. And I think that there's, to your point about privilege, is this sort of, even in our most even in our most vulnerable communities, there is still a sense of sort of like, I don't know, social welfare in a way that there's this weird baseline that we never have to go below. And this moment was this
Mm,
shock to the system in
yeah,
a way that got people thinking more broadly about what we really value
right,
and what those systems really imply, like what the implications are of a system that is predicated on someone being disenfranchised, and having to
right.
really look at that clearly. I think one of my main fears or maybe concerns is that in this sort of attempt to get over the trauma of the fear of this moment,
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm,
will dismiss the light that's being shined on these marginalized and sort of vulnerable communities, right? Like
mm-hmm,
we
mm-hmm.
may miss really interrogating income equality. I mean,
Right.
really, like those. Something about that is a little disheartening.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in what Detroit is feeling like now in terms of that sort of, not just the moment of COVID, but I feel like this moment of reckoning in a lot of ways with our food system
Mm-hmm.
is you see in some organizations being caught flat-footed, and some organizations like the ones I'm sure you're involved in, and certainly the ones that are have been in this work for generations, are kind of ready for this
Mm-hmm.
moment, seeing really innovative solutions come out of communities that will always prepare. But I think that goes back to your idea about people's value system and what we value in terms of being in community. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering what the feeling is in the community now, like how people are adjusting, what the lens of COVID did for
Yeah.
people's work.
So one, I think that COVID really unearths the vulnerability of all of our systems, right? It's showing us our education system, our childcare system, our food system, our transportation systems, our
Yes,
healthcare systems,
yes,
our like all of our systems in one moment are just on the verge of implosion, and we have to decide what that looks like and whether or not, not just whether or not, but how we'll care for ourselves when when these vulnerabilities arise. I think that the question that you asked me sort of about what I think my contribution has been, I do think that um, I'm grateful that Freedom Farmers is allowing us an option to think differently about our relationship to land, agriculture, and freedom, right? So it problematizes and moves beyond tenant farming, sharecropping, and slavery to one of land, food, and freedom. And in this moment, how significant and important that really is, right? To
yeah,
know that, and you said something that, organizations are prepared for this. And I would just push back lovingly and say,
mhm,
nobody's prepared for this.
okay,
No,
okay,
as in, it's the unexpected, and there are some ways that food production has been a part of, right? But that's food production in a limited context. And what I mean by that is, and I'm in Milwaukee right now, and how long do we grow, right? I've got some
okay,
romaine that I cut and I'm growing in my mason jars on the windowsill,
yeah,
but you know how long it takes to get a mouthful or get a bowl full of salad. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah,
like moving into inclement weather means that we have to be thinking differently, making sure that we are preserving and that kind of stuff. And so the question of are we ready is a significant question. And I think for those, I don't, it's difficult for me to say what's happening in Detroit now because I'm not in Detroit. You'd have to
okay,
ask Baba Malik Yakini or David,
yeah,
some of the folks that
yeah,
are still in Detroit to talk about levels of preparedness.
sure,
But I do think that food production for Black people, especially, everybody generally, but especially Black folks, I just feel like there's a new kind of question. And folks who formerly never thought about growing food are asking the question. And to me, the possibility is endless, right? If I
right,
can grow enough food to feed my family over the summer, and then we as a community all pull our resources together and share those, so if we can
mm,
control food system or impacts food system in this way, like what
that's
does
right,
this mean for these other entities like community policing, community, so
right,
it's just really
right,
the opportunity for us to build, to trust each other, and to think more broadly about what freedom looks like.
right. I think I was also thinking maybe more about preparedness with reference to the point you made about like the last decade of community building, allowing for folks
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah,
be
yeah,
prepared
yeah,
to
yeah,
think more dexterously.
yeah,
Is I mean, because I guess that's a really excellent point. I mean, because I think sometimes also, at least from my lens, I'm looking at people like Monica, like Karen Washington, or like Ben Burkett, like so a lot of these folks who seem a lot calmer in the midst of this moment
yeah,
because they have
right,
sort of they built for this sort of
right, yeah,
movement. And I
yeah,
wonder about how to translate what those tools look like to people who maybe hadn't thought about those ideas
yeah,
before now. Because it's like you said, it's really hard to sort of jump into movements and communities. I'm just hearing like a lot of conversation like in the ether around, okay, we got to get back to land, this really broad, like generalized way. But I don't know that we really have a real construct in terms of what that means, what that
yeah,
looks like, and
right,
how we don't have to necessarily reinvent spaces, but
right.
maybe think of supporting spaces that already exist and already doing this work.
That's right. Dara Cooper tells us that individually we're
Ooh,
vulnerable, but collectively we have power, right? And
yes.
so what I'm enjoying like this week and last week, I'm talking to more book clubs, right? I'm
Mm,
doing more book club conversations because folks are like, we read your book and so just having and engaging with folks who are thinking about this work in terms of freedom, but
mm,
also in terms of survival. That feels like a lot of the energy that's going on right now. I feel like folks are also talking about mutual aid in ways that we haven't,
yes.
right, before. And so I'm watching and witnessing the foundation of the U.S. Social Forum in 2012, which was the first time I heard about healing justice. And I'm watching folks talk about wellness, meditation, mindfulness,
Yep.
all these things. The foundation has been laid. And so now we are building on the work that we were involved in and committed, but sometimes it might be 3 people in the room. And now we got folks like, I'm doing yoga and it's, 50 Black and brown bodies just like,
That's
hey,
right.
let's move, let's be, And so it's just really beautiful to witness what this movement has meant and how it's benefited from previous movements, but to also think about what the legacies of this movement will be and how do we make sure we capture all of this so that our babies will learn and don't have to reinvent the wheel, but can build on what we've learned and show them in those
That's
ways.
exactly it. That's exactly it. And I guess that's something I was thinking about when we were talking earlier about your point about grace in terms of evaluating previous generations is really, I think, a central theme in how carefully and thoughtfully you took each point in history.
Mm.
But I wonder, because I'm really interested in what that. I feel sometimes there's a generational baton
Mm.
pass that gets missed, but
Yeah.
it got missed a little bit between civil rights era and our generation. And
Mm.
there are lots of reasons why that sort
Yeah.
of stockiness in terms of the time
Yeah.
pass happened. And that's one part of the part of the thoughts. But I'm wondering now about. I mean, I don't have children. Like I'm thinking about like just this sense of like what your how we secure this legacy in a way that is inclusive and so that we are sort of bringing up young people to be as careful and precious about the work that's happening now and carrying it forward. And I'm wondering if you have any insight because it just feels like it's just the ether of it all just feels
Yeah.
like our attention spans are very short. Our historical memory is very short sometimes. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking on that.
So, okay, so I think a few things. One is to make sure that our children are involved in this work, right? One of the jobs I had when I was working at D-Town was I had to run a vermicomposting workshop. Okay, if you know anything about me, I don't like worms. So I'm sitting here and I'm like, okay, I'm trying to I had a lecture. I had everything I was supposed to say all mapped out. And
Mm,
then it was time for me to, just actually have the students, to have the kids, they weren't listening to me. Girl, I popped the top on the bin and then, we doing a worm dance. And this is the name of my worm. And just to see children's energy when they were on the farm, I feel like including them in these ways is an important part of that legacy work. I think another part of the legacy work also includes making sure that we're capturing our voices in these moments. Now, I'm working on a project to help us diversify the historical lens of the work that we're doing now. But I
mm,
just think that there's certain voices that get elevated and are elevated now and often miss those who've done the work and who've laid that foundation.
that's
And I
right.
think the other part of it is to really sort of embrace and encourage people to ask the questions that haven't been asked. As I mentioned
Mm,
earlier, talking about Chimamanda Adichie's Danger of the Single Story, it's always important for me to think about whose voices are muted. And when I say that, what I mean is we often talk about giving voice to the voiceless. And I want you to never, ever, ever say that again.
mm,
There's no such thing as a voiceless. It's only those of us that are mute. So the reality for me is not voices of Flint. They weren't voiceless. They were yelling, they were screaming, they were, what I mean? They were like, look,
yes.
it's something wrong with the water.
Yep.
We chose to not hear, we chose to not listen, and that is a failure on our part. And
Right.
not necessarily, it was not a failure on their part. And so I
Right.
just really want us to think differently about that. Hold on, let me just close this door real quick. I'm
Hmm.
listening. I'm listening.
Yes. Um, you're absolutely right. And I think sometimes I'm thinking about relative to media and relative to how we tell stories, whether it's through books, whether it's, sort of like, sort of publications that exist digitally or in print. And even and certainly the way we contextualize these stories in news cycles.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering about the posture change that has to happen in those spaces as well. Because your point about like that is so that I'm gonna have to sit with that voiceless comment again for a little while because it sort of disempowers people immediately. It suggests
Right.
that people are complacent in spaces that they
Right.
occupy and
Right.
not so much like I think sometimes we overstate the relative power of people in communities that are being systemically oppressed.
I'm
Like you can't
saying.
how you can scream from the mountaintops about the water crisis, but if your government is legitimately not listening and are not willing to do,
Right.
how will
Right.
you, other
Right.
than screaming
Yeah.
from the rooftop? That's not
Right.
your point. That's not voiceless. That's being unheard.
Right. Right.
Oh my
Right.
gosh,
Right. Right.
that's gonna be the word of this whole thing. That's
Okay, but wait, let
big.
me back. Okay, so you said before. Okay, you got what was the first part? The first part of your question.
Let's see.
What?
This is so good. I'm sorry. Like
Oh, no, 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 because it was I had it and then got all a rush. Not the voiceless. What was the other part of it?
we were thinking. I was asking about just being how we continue to be precious about this moment and make sure
Right.
that we don't lose the sort of electricity
Right.
of movement. Because I think sometimes also they feel sometimes like in moments like these where people feel like powerless or disempowered or
Yes.
whatever that they
Woo.
the feeling of like where to start and just like do anything, like make any movement
Yes.
because you want
Yes.
to feel
Yes.
empowered,
Yes.
but it doesn't
Yes.
necessarily
Yes.
breed like long term sustainable
Yes.
like
Yes.
and I wonder about what that should look like because it just feels sometimes like what are the right things, like what are
What
things that
right?
are
What should I be doing? And the thing is, you should be doing something. We should all
yes,
be doing something. And I
yes,
think we shouldn't compare what we're doing to others unless we realize that we're not giving all that we can, right? Because
mm,
I feel like we need all hands on deck, and all gifts are valuable and important, right?
that's right.
I also think that there is that I have a student, my student Devin, and I check in on him. He graduated, and one of mine, and so I called, and we were having this conversation, and I asked him how he was doing, and he said, I caught myself laughing. And then I asked myself, how can I, in the moment of this devastation, have this moment of, and
Yes.
he gave me goosebumps. He may not know, but I wept. And it's been something that I've also struggled with. So in the midst of this, I've been thinking about what does Black joy look like in this moment,
Mm,
right? And so Black joy it's a part of every resistance moment and movement that we've ever had. I haven't read anything that really talks about it within this lens of a part of resistance, right?
yes.
You're gonna lose your job, right? Like,
Yeah.
hey,
Right.
so
Right.
just thinking about the phrases that we're capturing, the celebration that we see in the moments of protest, when we think and see, like, so to me, acts are defined as acts of resistance depending upon who's doing the work. So for me, my act of resistance might be planting the seed and making
Right.
sure that, we have one less tomato that we have to buy at the grocery store. It could
That's right.
be I've got so many tomatoes that I'm giving them to my neighbors and to my elders, right? So to me, resistance is resistance as defined by the person who resists.
Mm,
And so I think that we're finding a range of methods. And how do we embrace this moment? And how do we capture it in such a way so that our future generations know that you don't have to feel badly for joy. And I told him, I said, you don't owe anyone your happiness. As a matter of fact, when you are happy, that is resisting. Like, to me, that's what, I mean, people want you to be walking around moping. People want us to be sad and disappointed. People look at us and say, how dare you? How dare you? Who, what? And then for us to find these moments of joy and happiness is a necessary component of the sustainability of this work.
that's right.
Right.
That's
And
right.
Davida reminds us of the Our Lord
Yes.
quote, which is caring for myself it's more than self-preservation. It is by definition an act of resistance because folks don't expect me to take care of myself,
Yes.
to celebrate, to laugh. That's the only way this work is sustainable. And if we've learned nothing from our civil rights activists who, laid their lives on the line and did all they could, gave us everything, we have an obligation to carry this healing justice as a part of how we move forward and how we get free.
Mm, mm.
Okay,
Dr. White, we do okay. So we're doing really good on time. I
good.
want to make
Oh,
sure
you
that
got it all hot up here. Where my tambourine, girl? You got
exactly right.
it. I
I
love
want
you
to make sure we
so.
leave room for people to ask questions if they have them. I've been kind of
Yep.
trying to follow some of the comments, but there haven't been any sort of explicit questions. So I have more we can talk about. If people don't have
Okay.
legitimate questions. Um, but well, I think what was the thing we wanted to put a pin in and circle back to? Did we circle back? I feel like
I think we did. I think I
yeah, I feel
tried
like
to weave it back in. Now, if
yeah.
I didn't do it to your pleasure, then just let me know. But I feel like,
I feel like we did a good job of weaving. You did a good job of weaving. Really.
it's a tag team,
Um,
sis.
I really hope people are empowered to immediately buy this book because it's so
Thank
beautiful.
you.
I wonder if there were any, because I feel like there's sometimes a sense that even with the lack of clarity in the way we teach Black history and teach these figures, um, somebody like you who has had or been involved in Black culture so explicitly all your life, these are stories that I think that maybe you were from, like, that you knew about, and I'm sure that
Yeah.
there were lines of logic that made sense and sort of broaden your understanding. But was there anything you were surprised about that, like, or that you just were completely caught off guard about?
You know, I think most of the book, right? Most
Yeah.
of the book, because to me, when I when I set out to write a book about Black farming, I thought about, you know, the work we were doing in Detroit and the stories that
Mm.
I knew about the South. But every time I turned a corner, I was learning something brilliant or amazing that I wanted to make sure, like, oh, I gotta, okay, oh, we gotta, ooh, okay. So, and
Mm.
even to find that Mrs. Hamer spent a lot of time at UW-Madison and was here in with University of Wisconsin-Madison. She spent a lot of time here at the Center for Cooperatives, where they were talking about developing co-ops. And I met families who had welcomed Mrs. Hamer into her home. So that was blowing my mind.
Right.
There are all kinds of stories. And when you touch the documents, there's just such a reverence for, this is the receipt for free. I mean, you know, just such a reverence
Yeah.
for those actual documents that I think is important. But I think the thing that I would really like to sort of capture is um, um, consistent with Alice Walker's quote, "In search of my mother's garden, I found my own." So here I am thinking, oh, you know, I'm an activist and an academic. I'm gonna tell the story about Black people and Black farms, and I'm gonna go out into the world and I'm gonna, you know, do this thing from a sociological perspective.
Right.
Well, once I finished the book and had it, you know, had submitted the last version for edits, I called my aunt. My aunt and I were talking, and I remembered that my granddaddy and my grandma, granddaddy Kenneth and grandma Pearl in Eden, North Carolina, had a store in the front of the house.
Mm.
And so, and they were farmers, right? And
Mm.
so it's like, oh, Oasis store was fun. Whoop, whoop, hey, get all the double bubble you won and all that kind of stuff. What I didn't know was, until after I wrote the book, was that the store was a community store. It
Mm.
was a part of a co-op. My grandfather and 8 other farmers had purchased a car together, and they were able to, through the store, to buy farm implements and house, you know, items with
Right.
respect from, right? And so, like, I'm sitting here like, how in the world? I knew they were farmers, but I didn't know they were part of a co-op. That's not a language that we grew up using. So
Mm.
I'm sitting here and I'm like, can you imagine spending all these years writing about someone, what you think is somebody else's story, and then to turn around and have the universe show you that it was in fact your own?
Right.
I'm trying to tell you, I'm
Mm.
sitting there like mind blown. So now when I
Yeah.
give talks, I show pictures of my grandparents, because the idea is that, you know, we knew what they did, but we didn't know why they did what they did. And so using the tools of the academy allowed me to unearth the story of my own family. So now I'm, you know, when this whatever we got going on right here is lifted, I want to go back to North Carolina. You know, my granddaddy inherited that land from
Mm.
his daddy. So like, I need to know these stories.
That's right.
I want to know all of this. And like you, I don't have children, but I think it's our obligation as a part of a Black collective consciousness to make sure that you document, you know, culinary, you know, significant figures and
Mm.
stories. I do my thing. Like, even though we don't have children, I do think that the next
Yeah.
generation can benefit from our collection of these voices and these stories, and using these lenses to say, like, you know, here's what I picked up, and here's
Yeah.
what I'm putting down. And then they
That's
look
right.
at you and they say, okay, well, here's what I'm picking up, and here's what I'm putting down. So I do think that that's, you know, a
Yeah.
part of this beautiful moment. And let me say this is a hot moment in food justice conversations, right?
Right.
If you think about the work of Dr. Shante Reese's book, Black
Mm.
Food, right? You think about Leah Penniman's book, and you think about even Natasha Bowen's book. All
Yeah.
of us, Black women, all of us, our intros, our, you know, our prefaces were all done by sisters in the movement, you know.
That's right.
So I just feel like there's a richness of this moment that I'm enjoying, and being a
Mm.
part of. And I feel like we need to read all of these books. We need to
Yeah.
read all these resources, and we need to make sure that our organizations have archives that are safe from fire and flood. That we,
Yes.
you know, I mean, the Schomburg is a Schomburg because somebody thought to put those pieces, those
That's
collections, and to
right.
treat them as precious. So like our organizations need to have all of our history, all of our information, like all of this that we're doing needs to be captured, and there need to be a variety of voices to really capture this work. And I think it's a beautiful time in the midst of struggle, in the midst of conflict, in the midst of death. I choose to look at the beauty that is coming out of this as a way to figure out our way forward.
Amen. Yes. I always, I mean, somebody you lifted up who I don't, I feel like I know, but I don't know enough about, and I'm always so empowered and impacted when I hear her speak or think. Dara Cooper, does she have a book out in the world? Because I just, something about her voice is always so clear and
Always on
fluid.
time, always on point.
Always.
Soon
Like,
come, sis. Soon come. You
I
need
just,
to ask her. Soon come.
yeah, please. 'Cause I need words from her too. Um,
Yes, yes, yes.
there weren't really a lot of questions that got asked. There was a comment around, and I feel like we talked about it a little bit, but in this moment, I think in the midst, like just in this sort of, the question was asked in a broad way, but essentially the question was asking, um, what's the end roles? How do we get people interested, invested,
Yeah,
in the sort of food justice movement,
yeah.
and what is how like what are places that you would, if someone had no reference point but were in communities, like just where should they start?
Hmm.
Because I always feel like I point people to, especially in the New York area, I point people to
Sure.
Karen Washington,
Right,
but
right,
I
right.
wonder about like what inroads are into
Yeah, yeah,
movements. I feel like in a lot
yeah.
of ways it might be what you
That's
talked
right.
about in terms of like how you show up and like how
Right.
you show up humbly and ask questions.
Yeah,
Because I feel like folks who've been doing this work already maybe are
right.
more receptive if you
Yeah.
are coming with an open heart. But I mean, I just wonder if there are specific tools people could
Yeah.
think about.
Well, yes, there are tools, and yes, there are entry points, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that a good place to start would be the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, which these are Black-led organizations that are already rooted in community and doing incredible work. So
Yes.
I would start there to see who is close to me, who's near me, who's doing what. So after the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, I would do a search to see what organizations are in my specific area,
That's right.
both National Black Food and Justice, but also just broadly define these organizations. And I think what we also see, so we see organizations that are doing this for political reasons, right? Food justice folks, food justice organizers.
Mm.
But I also think that every single entity has to be concerned about increasing access to nutrient rich food. So we
Mm.
can't have schools that don't have gardens. We can't have churches that don't have gardens. Holla, shout to Reverend Heber Brown.
Yes.
We can't have hospitals need to be thinking about different food and how they need to have gardens. Like, I don't know of a single entity, a political entity or social entity, that it should not be thinking about food. And so how then, and one of the things that I think we often feel, sort of ambivalent about, or not ambivalent, but really not, pretty clear, is emergency food providers, right? And
Mm.
so we know that they serve a purpose, but also are a little skeptical about our need for emergency food. And
Yeah.
yet emergency food can be thinking about how to increase the use of their commercial kitchens in ways that are integrated into community growing spaces and those resources. And so I think it has to be all hands on deck.
That's
All of
right.
us, from the one seed that we plant to the whole yard that we have, you know what I'm saying?
That's
Everybody
right.
has to be thinking about what are the things that we need to be happy, healthy, and whole. And it's not just a me thing. And I think what this experience is showing us is that, one, we need people that we didn't think we needed. And in some cases, we need people that we talk pretty poorly about. And now we're
Woo,
sort
that
of
part.
rethinking our position, right? And I also think that this is an opportunity for us to think about the ways to collaborate with entities that we may not have thought we had anything in common. In other words, I know in movement spaces, it's the food justice movement over here, it's the school justice movement over here, it's the disability justice over here, it's the transportation justice over here. But what we all, I think, this opportunity shows us is that we're all vulnerable. And if we're all vulnerable, then we need to unite so that we can, coalesce
Yeah,
around those things that stop us from being great.
that's absolutely right. I'm also thinking about shout out to Reverend Dr. Heber Brown. We talked to him last week,
Right?
and then 2 or 3 weeks ago, I talked to Shakira Assembly, and she's in San Francisco, and she's doing work. She's the director of the Office of Racial Equity for the city of San Francisco. And that job doesn't exist a lot of places, but it does exist around the country. And she was talking about how her, in the midst of when COVID sort of hit and San Francisco, like, sort of really got serious about what response was going to look like, her job changed in, like immediately. But that through the lens of her work, she's still able to sort of think about the ways in which political spaces, like government spaces, are pivoting to answer questions and calls to show up for communities in ways they have never, like in unprecedented ways. How money is being distributed all of a sudden miraculously, and how solutions have become a lot more innovative. And I'm wondering about some of the things that are happening now in terms of the way we think about community feeding, the way we think about cooperative farming, all those elements.
Yeah.
It sounds so innovative now. People are all of a sudden pivoting in ways that are so innovative.
Right.
And I'm wondering if in this, I think it goes back to something we talked about earlier, but just I get concerned sometimes that we like discounting how innovative these solutions are, and
Honey, please.
but how necessary they're going to be even outside. Do you think we're necessary even outside of the context of COVID? And so I'm wondering if we're going to have the will to continue some of these programs, because some of what she here was just talking about, like, just how more efficiently some services are operating now, because they cut out all the shenanigans and just get down to actually servicing people. And I'm wondering if there's any, like, if we even thinking about that, because it just feels like it would be a missed opportunity. And I don't want us to.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So to me, the thing is that as somebody who, when I become empowered, it's difficult for you to take that away from me. Realize that my strength can go into feeding my family. And what does feeding my family allow me to do? It allows me the creative possibility of my own sort of political control, and to think about other ways. If I'm talking and thinking about healthcare in particular ways that are normalized and institutionalized, and I'm forgetting the purslane and the dandelion root that grows in my yard, like, so I think I'm a sociologist, so I'm not a prognostic. I can't tell you, like, I have no, my magic ball ain't working. But for me, the reality that when people realize how vulnerable we are, I think we're reluctant to allow ourselves to be as dependent on a system, at least this generation.
Yes.
If these are the lessons that we pass ahead for our children, to know how to fill in the blank, right? You need to know how to, that was my dad, here's a toolbox, you need to know. He was like, you need to change diapers and change a tire. So boom, right?
That's right.
So just thinking about all the ways that our independence, our self-reliance, and our agency in this moment, and making sure that we hold on to these lessons. I feel like that's something that we owe ourselves. We owe ourselves this.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Oh my goodness. We did it. I feel like we covered a lot. I feel like I mean, I swear I will hold you hostage forever. But I'm just so grateful for you. I'm grateful that we have your intellect and space, that we have your words. I don't know. Is there anything you're working on now that's forthcoming?
My goodness. So many. So Sister Dara and I have these therapy walks that we do every morning. She's in Atlanta. I'm here in Milwaukee. And we talk, and she keeps giving me these papers to do. So I've got some projects that I'm working on right now. I'm also working on the history of the Paris family. The elder Paris was the first Black USDA loan officer, and his sons have been parts of movements for over 50, 60 years. So they're incredible, and their story just reaches across so many movements of their lives. And it's something that I'm really excited about. I'm on sabbatical, so my job is to sort of write the Paris book and just some other kinds of pieces and, some trails and some ways that I feel like I can make a contribution to this movement moment.
I love that. I love it. So please, Freedom Farmers is so beautiful. I mean, you can get it right now. I swear to God, the bibliography alone, I swear to, like, the level of thought and thoroughness in your research is amazing. But I mean, it's 146 pages. You can get through this in a weekend, and it is brilliant. And it will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about these figures, and it will make you more empowered to sort of get out and be part of beautiful solutions. I do
want to say this. Folks are asking where to buy the book. And
Mm-hmm.
my recommendation is to find a Black bookstore
Please, please
and
do.
support a Black bookstore. They may need to order it. And if a Black bookstore wants me to sign some copies and you send
Okay.
them to me, I will sign them. Like, I
Awesome.
really want to make sure that we support all parts of the system, right?
That's right.
So support, buy the book or borrow the book or however you get it, but make sure whatever that source is gets to benefit from that
That's
revenue.
right. That's right. Yeah, I think we can put a period. I appreciate you so much. I
Oh, I
appreciate your
appreciate
time.
you. Thank you.
And yeah, just please read this book and share it. There were some other titles that we listed up that are equally as brilliant. I think if you go to my website, I have tons of reading lists and all these books are there. But please just read this book and get your life. Um,
Thank you.
but thank you so much, Dr.
Love
White.
and appreciate you, sis. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Okay, y'all. So this was brilliant. Monica White is one of the greatest minds of our generation. Um, my site is blackcolonialhistory.com, and I have like 8 reading lists that are sort of organized in this book, as well as the Penniman's Soul Fire Farm manual, a bunch of books. I mean, they're all brilliant, but Freedom Farmers, go get it. Later on today, if you go over to Black Food Folks at 3 o'clock, Paula Velez is going to be on having a conversation with a pastry chef at 3 p.m. over on Black Food Folks. So if you are so inclined to have time this afternoon, just check out Black Food Folks. And these conversations are brought to you in collaboration with Afropunk and Black Food Folks. So please just going over, if you haven't been, check out the Black Food Folks feed, and I'll see you guys next week. I have my good friend Chef Christy Brown, who's based in Seattle, who's a really brilliant community organizer, urban farmer, and chef, and she's got a new restaurant forthcoming. So that conversation is going to be really good too. Definitely a little bit more culinary focused, but certainly talking about how to sort of be effective in this moment. But thank y'all so much. This was really good, and I will see you guys next week.